The Red Line, the Boston subway cult. Part 1. The lingering unease. The digital clock on the monitoring room wall read 11:57 p.m. Outside, the fine autumn rain beat against the grimy windows of the Downtown Crossing subway station in Boston, luring the streetlights into hazy halos. Daniel Hayes, 29, a former veteran with a strong build and weary eyes, adjusted his headphones and turned his attention to the multiple monitors displaying Red Line cars sliding in and out of stations. Just another night shift. The routine was monotonous, almost meditative. Checking security feeds, responding to maintenance calls, and ensuring the city's last lost souls made it home or somewhere. For Daniel, who suffered from chronic insomnia since his return from service, the subway's nighttime quiet, paradoxically, offered a kind of calm. It was a familiar isolation within the crowd, something he'd grown accustomed to since leaving active duty and finding himself back in the whirlwind of a civilian life that seemed to have no place for him. He felt disconnected, a shadow observing other shadows. This feeling, however, had deepened in recent weeks. It wasn't just his own melancholy. Something else seemed to permeate the damp, metallic air of the tunnels. His colleague, Sarah Chun, 32, the radio operator, furiously typed at her terminal, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off her glasses. She was efficient, practical, focused on numbers and procedures. Daniel knew she wouldn't see what he saw. "Everything all right over there, Daniel?" Sarah asked, without looking up from her monitor. "All clear. Just the last few trains. A strange figure or two wandering around. The usual," Daniel replied, his voice a little hoarse from disuse. But it wasn't the usual. In recent weeks, Daniel had noticed subtle anomalies. Sounds that the ventilation system shouldn't be making. Indistinct whispers that seemed to come from the speakers in the corner of the room, even when the system was inactive. And more disturbingly, the security cameras. Sometimes, for a flash, the image on one of the monitors would flicker, not to static, but to a brief, unsettling glimpse. A dark, seemingly empty tunnel, but with an indistinct shape moving rapidly in the depths, or a cluster of motionless figures staring directly at the camera before the image returned to normal. He'd attributed it to technical glitches, to fatigue. But the visions became more frequent, though still so fleeting he could never be sure. It was always a blur, a shadow his mind desperately tried to rationalize. Daniel's insomnia worsened. He spent his nights staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, his mind filled with the sounds of the subway, now mixed with non-existent whispers and the phantom images from the monitors. The following week brought a subtle yet undeniable escalation of unease. Daniel started seeing graffiti. It wasn't the usual gang tags or juvenile love messages. These were strange symbols. Complex geometric shapes, circles with lines extending like tentacles or stylized eyes. Drawn in dark colors, brick red, jet black in unusual places. On the walls of less traveled tunnels, on isolated platform pillars, even, once, scratched onto the foggy glass of a deactivated subway car window. "Sarah, have you seen these new graffiti tags on the Red Line?" Daniel asked one night, pointing to an image he'd captured on a remote maintenance camera. They looked different, too elaborate for regular delinquents. Sarah barely glanced. "Oh yeah. The cleaning crew is complaining. Some new street art group. The city goes through phases." She shrugged it off. Daniel tried to discuss it with other security colleagues. Most dismissed it as kids looking for attention or tourists with spray paint. No one saw what he saw. A strange coherence in the symbols, a pattern that seemed to repeat, a sense that they weren't random. Then, the disappearances began. First, a small, largely ignored local newspaper headline. Young student missing after party night in Harvard Square. Then, a well-known homeless man who often slept at Park Street Station simply stopped appearing. And with each disappearance, The conversation in the station hallways shifted. Whispers about the Red Line swallowing people. "Did you hear about old Patrick?" An older colleague commented at the coffee station. "Hasn't shown up in days." "And that girl from last week, police are investigating, but no leads." "Weird stuff. It's Boston. Happens." Another, more cynical colleague retorted. "People get lost, especially at night." But Daniel knew it wasn't the usual. The disappearances were aligning with the areas where the strange symbols appeared most frequently. He began to feel a peculiar presence during his nightly patrols on the darkened platforms. It wasn't something he could see, but a sense of weight in the air, as if the oxygen was being sucked away. A low hum in the ground that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. And the whispers. They were no longer indistinct. In empty tunnels or dark service corridors, Daniel started to hear voices in his mind. Voices that spoke of loneliness. Voices that offered connection, comfort, promises. They were seductive and chilling at the same time, echoing the very loneliness Daniel felt. "You're not alone, ... we see you. We understand you, ... He tried to ignore them, attributing it to insomnia, to stress. But with each passing night, the Red Line seemed more alive, more hungry, calling him into the depths of its secrets. He was a veteran trained to deal with visible danger. But how do you fight something that whispered in your mind and fed on despair? The line between reality and nightmare was dissolving, and Daniel knew he was being dragged into something far older and darker than any war he had ever known. Part 2. Beneath the surface. Each night, Daniel's obsession with the symbols and disappearances grew. His colleagues' indifference only solidified his conviction that something was terribly wrong. He began to use his patrol hours to venture beyond the usual routes, exploring the less used areas of the subway system where security cameras were few or inoperable, and where urban legends mingled with the musty air. His knowledge of the subway, acquired from patrolling, and his prior maintenance experience was his greatest advantage. He knew every curve, every service tunnel, every hidden access door. He knew that some sections of the Red Line were ancient, predating most modernizations, with stretches that had been abandoned or repurposed over time. These were the places that called to him. On a particularly cold and rainy night, with the wind hissing through the ventilation grates, Daniel decided to follow a trail of new graffiti. It led him through a narrow, dark, rarely used maintenance tunnel, one he had ignored for years. The smell of rusted metal and damp concrete was suffocating. The only light came from his flashlight, which danced across the walls, revealing dense cobwebs and trickling water that formed small puddles on the uneven floor. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but Daniel felt a strange pull, a morbid curiosity that propelled him forward. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger, cavernous space, a completely abandoned subway station. It was a sight from another era. The tracks were covered in dust and debris. The old posters on the walls were faded and torn, and the signs indicated a name no longer on Boston's current subway map: Davenport Square. The station was steeped in a sepulchral silence, broken only by the constant drip of water and the distant, muffled sound of trains passing on the active line above. It was a place of forgottenness, an echo of a Boston that no longer existed. But it wasn't entirely abandoned. In the center of the platform, there was a cluster of half-melted tallow candles, surrounded by strange objects: small pieces of bones, strands of hair, ancient coins, and a few faded photographs of smiling people, the happy faces in sinister contrast with the environment. In front of this offering, one of the graffiti symbols was painted large and crude on the floor, still wet in some places. Daniel felt a shiver. These weren't delinquents or street artists. This was an altar. He examined the objects with his flashlight, a cold dread washing over him when his eyes landed on the photos. These weren't unknown artists. These were faces he recognized from the missing persons report Sarah filed. The young student from Harvard Square, The homeless man, Patrick. They hadn't gotten lost. They had been brought here. A chilling whisper, almost a lament, seemed to come from somewhere in the dark tunnel of the abandoned station. Daniel recoiled, his flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing. He was alone, but the feeling that something was watching him was overwhelming. He picked up one of the ancient coins from the altar, feeling it cold and heavy in his hand, tangible proof of the horror's existence. The discovery of Davenport Square Station confirmed Daniel's worst fears. This wasn't folklore, it was real. The Red Line wasn't just swallowing people. Something was luring them into the depths. From that night on, the entity's influence became more direct and disturbing. The subway's communication systems began to malfunction in peculiar ways. Instead of the familiar beep of doors closing, Daniel would hear, on the platform speakers he monitored, distorted, overlaid voices, like hundreds of whispers speaking at once, but with isolated words standing out. Lonely. We see you ... come. We will give you ... Lights in the tunnels and even in sections of the monitoring room began to flicker erratically, casting dancing shadows that appeared to be moving forms. The smell of damp earth and decay was now a constant, mixed with a persistent metallic odor, almost like copper and rust. Daniel's insomnia worsened into vivid, recurring nightmares. He dreamed he was in a dark, endless station, with tracks stretching as far as the eye could see, and voices called him from the dark. He saw shadows moving between the columns, and the constant sound of an approaching train that never arrived. The most disturbing, however, were the people. Daniel started noticing passengers he'd never seen before, or who seemed out of place. They were usually solitary figures, sitting silently on platforms at odd hours, staring into the void with an expression of resignation or a strange serenity. They didn't seem to be waiting for a train. They seemed to be waiting for something more. One day, while patrolling the South Station platform, Daniel saw a middle-aged woman, cleanly dressed but with a distant gaze, standing at the edge of the empty platform. She didn't move for several minutes, just staring into the tunnel. Suddenly, she pulled a small item from her pocket. It looked like an amulet made of twigs and twine, and carefully dropped it onto the tracks. She then turned and walked towards the exit, a slight, enigmatic smile on her face, as if relieved. Daniel followed her. She didn't appear to be in danger, but her behavior was strange, and he saw others doing similar things at other stations, leaving small objects in dark corners, whispering to the walls, or simply standing motionless with an empty stare. He was seeing the Red Line cult. They weren't fanatics in robes. They were ordinary people, torn by the city's loneliness, who had been recruited by the entity. They had found a connection in the void, and now they were its unwitting servants. Daniel tried to show Sarah images of these incidents, but she dismissed it as mental health issues of lonely passengers or harmless, eccentric rituals. Daniel, you need to relax. The job's making you paranoid. Go home and get some sleep. He knew it wasn't paranoia. The Red Line was infected. The entity was growing, feeding on human misery, and its new disciples were everywhere, silently spreading its influence and luring new victims. Daniel was alone against something ancient and dark that moved beneath the city's bright lights and bustle, invisible to everyone except those who heard its call. Part 3. The Cult Revealed. The certainty that what was happening wasn't a figment of his imagination led Daniel to a grim determination. He needed proof. In the following nights, he began to use his patrol hours not just to observe the symbols or the strange individuals on the platforms, but to follow. Patiently, discreetly, he tracked one of the recruited individuals, a middle-aged woman who always appeared at Park Street Station at 3 a.m., stood for a few minutes with an empty gaze, and then took a train in a direction that wasn't her home. In the dark hours of one early morning, Daniel followed her from a distance. The woman got off at a less busy station and entered a service tunnel that Daniel knew led to an old, deactivated section of the Red Line. It was a stretch that had been sealed off decades ago due to structural issues and supposedly had never been accessed since. The air in the tunnel was dense and heavy, carrying the smell of mold, dirt, and something else, a sweet, sickly odor Daniel couldn't place. Only his flashlight cut through the absolute darkness. He heard the constant drip of water, and as he advanced, a distant, repetitive whisper that sounded like a muffled chant. He moved with a veteran's training, light steps, controlled breathing, eyes and ears alert for any anomaly. The tunnel walls here were older, the bricks damp and stained. The bizarre symbols were more abundant, painted or scratched onto the walls, sometimes with what appeared to be a dark, clotted substance, which Daniel prayed was just rust. The chanting grew clearer. They weren't discernible words, but a monotonous, hypnotic melody that seemed to nestle in his ears and mind, making his head throb gently. The tunnel finally opened into a cavernous space, a secret, colossal, and completely abandoned station. It was far larger than Davenport Square, a forgotten underground complex with multiple platforms and tracks that vanished into the darkness. The ceiling was high and vaulted, with concrete stalactites hanging like sharp teeth. In the center of the main platform, dozens of figures were gathered. They were men and women of all ages and social classes, dressed in ordinary clothes, but their faces were strangely serene, almost catatonic. They were arranged in concentric circles, swaying slowly back and forth as they intoned the monotonous chant. At the center of the circle, on an improvised altar made of rubble, was a pile of objects: cell phones, wallets, identification documents, and more of those ancient coins Daniel had found in Davenport. Around the altar, the symbols were painted in enormous sizes on the floor, some of them still wet with paint. Daniel felt a chill. These weren't delinquents or eccentric artists. This was an altar. He observed, shocked and terrified. This wasn't a quirky little group. This was an organized cult. They weren't physically sacrificing people. They were collecting loneliness, fear, essence. The disappearances were, in fact, a recruitment process where the entity connected with the city's most vulnerable souls, offering a false sense of belonging and, in return, absorbing them. The personal items were offerings, a way to detach from their outer lives and embrace the void the entity promised. Then, the manifestation. In the center of the chanting circle, the air began to undulate. There was no light, but the darkness there deepened, condensed. It seemed to vibrate with a cold, invisible energy. The cult members' chanting intensified, the melody growing more urgent, more hungry. Daniel felt an overwhelming pressure in his mind, as if 1,000 voices whispered at once, offering him peace, an end to his insomnia, the connection he so desperately sought. It was the entity's voice, but not from the air. It was from within him, echoing his own loneliness. He clutched his temples, feeling the temptation of the promise. It was almost unbearable. Daniel's loneliness was an open wound, and the entity seemed to know exactly where to press. It took all his willpower to resist the call. As Daniel fought against the entity's psychic influence, he made a mistake. A small noise, a piece of concrete, broke loose under his boot. The sound, minuscule in the silence of that vast chamber, reverberated. The chanting abruptly ceased. The cult members' heads turned in unison, their faces impassive, but their eyes, empty and expressionless, fixed on the column where Daniel was hiding. There was no anger, no fear in them, just a cold determination. One of them, a man in a suit who looked like he'd just stepped out of an office, began to move slowly towards the column. He didn't run, just walked with a strange precision, like an automaton. Daniel realized he'd been discovered. He had only seconds. Icy panic hit him. He had seen what happened to the recruited. He turned and ran back towards the tunnel he had entered through. The sound of his frantic footsteps echoed, and he could hear the slow but relentless steps of the cult member behind him. "He's here." He saw ... The entity's voice whispered again in Daniel's mind, now with a mocking tone. Daniel ran blindly through the narrow, dark tunnel, his flashlight swinging wildly, illuminating damp walls and scurrying rats. He could feel their presence, the cult members closing in. Not just the man pursuing him, but others, emerging from side tunnels he knew. They were cornering him in the labyrinth. He dove into a secondary maintenance passage, a tight shortcut he could barely fit through, hoping they would be too large to follow. He crawled between pipes and electrical wires, the air suffocating and heavy. As he crawled, the entity's voice became a roar in his mind, accompanied by flashing images of his worst fears: overwhelming loneliness, oblivion, the loss of himself. He felt a pang of hopelessness so profound he almost gave up right there. But he remembered the faces in the photographs on the altar, the missing. He couldn't end up like them. He emerged into an active subway tunnel, where emergency lights flickered dimly. He heard the sound of an approaching train. It was his last chance. He dragged himself onto the platform, ignoring the pain in his knees and elbows, and threw himself into the first car that opened its doors just in time. The train jolted forward, carrying Daniel away from the darkness. He collapsed onto an empty seat, panting, staring at the dark windows rushing past the tunnels. He saw no one on the platforms he had left behind, but he knew they were there. The Red Line cult was active, and the entity still called from the depths. Daniel had survived, but the escape had cost him dearly. He was no longer just investigating. He was at war, and he was the only one who knew. Part 4. The final confrontation and the epilogue. Daniel's escape from the underground station had confirmed his deepest fears. He knew the truth, but the isolation was overwhelming. The morning after his terrifying return, he tried to alert the authorities. He started with Sarah, his radio colleague, showing her photos of the symbols and trying to describe the cult and the entity. Sarah listened with a mix of concern and incredulity. "Daniel, you look exhausted." "That sounds like sleep deprivation delirium." "Those are just graffiti, and the disappearances ... There are cases of people getting lost, unfortunately." She suggested he take a leave of absence, maybe seek professional help. He tried to go further. He spoke to his supervisor, a pragmatic man named Murphy. Murphy listened to the story with forced patience, but his eyes showed clear irritation. "Ace, I understand the night shift can be lonely, but we need to focus on work. We don't have time for urban legends. If you have concrete proof of something illegal, bring it. Otherwise, that's just bar talk." He threatened Daniel with suspension for erratic behavior. Daniel realized he was alone. No one would believe him. The entity had burrowed so deeply beneath the city that it was invisible to those who didn't seek it out, and its servants seemed perfectly normal. The loneliness the entity exploited in others now surrounded him. His insomnia became almost total. He spent his nights researching old Boston legends, forgotten underground maps, and conspiracy theories about secret societies. He found mentions of a 19th century cult that worshipped an abyssal presence beneath the city, and legends of portals to oblivion in old train stations. Terrifying, but they confirmed his fears. He realized the entity wasn't a monster of flesh and blood. It was a hunger, a psychic resonance that existed through human disconnection and despair. The only way to fight it wasn't with weapons, but by cutting off its sustenance and its connection. The ritual he had witnessed was the key. The altar, the symbols, the chanting, all served to amplify the entity's influence. Daniel formulated a plan. He would use his knowledge of the subway to reach the secret station again. He couldn't destroy the entity, but perhaps he could disrupt its ritual, cut off its food source, and who knew, weaken it or make it fall dormant again. He packed a backpack with essential supplies, extra flashlights, a two-way radio, tools to cut wires, and, crucially, an old portable speaker. A week later, Daniel was back in the tunnel. The night was dark and moonless, the thin rain turning Boston's streets into shimmering mirrors. The underground air was denser, the smell of decay stronger. The loneliness was almost palpable, but this time, Daniel wasn't helpless. He was on a mission. He moved silently through the maintenance corridors, his flashlight a solitary beam in the oppressive darkness. The entity's whispers tried to invade his mind, promising relief, an end to his insomnia, the cessation of his loneliness. He fought them with determination. He refused to be a puppet. Finally, he reached the entrance to the vast abandoned station. The low chanting echoed, and the darkness in the center of the main platform seemed to deepen, pulsing. The cult was there, gathered again. Daniel found a closer vantage point, behind a massive pile of abandoned subway equipment. He turned on the portable speaker, selecting a frequency. It wasn't relaxing music. It was high-volume white noise, a specific frequency he had researched, known to disrupt electronic devices and, theoretically, brainwave patterns. He hoped it would disrupt the entity's connection. He had also brought cans of white spray paint. His plan: disrupt the ritual, blind the symbols that served as conductors, and disturb the entity. At the right moment, when the chanting reached its peak and the darkness in the center of the platform seemed to ride, Daniel acted. Daniel emerged from behind the pile of equipment, his headlamp shining and the portable speaker blasting deafening white noise. The sound reverberated through the vast station, a brutal shock against the cult's hypnotic chanting. The cult members stopped abruptly. Their heads turned towards Daniel, not with anger, but with momentary confusion, as if they had awakened from a trance. The darkness in the center of the platform seemed to writhe in agony, the voices in Daniel's mind turning into a high-pitched shriek of pain. "Intruder! He sees us! Stop!" The entity shrieked in his mind. The cult members began to move. Not in a coordinated attack, but as if confused and, at the same time, propelled by an invisible force. Their movements were awkward, but persistent, like sleepwalkers. Daniel didn't wait. He ran towards the altar, the white spray paint in his hand. As he ran, he frantically covered the painted symbols on the floor, the bizarre lines and circles that served as focal points for the entity. The white paint covered the dark drawings, and with each symbol obscured, the voice in Daniel's mind shrieked in pain. The cult members were closing in, some tripping over each other. Daniel felt the cold air as the entity tried to counterattack, invading his mind with flashes of loneliness and despair. He stumbled, but kept going. Finally, he reached the altar. With his last ounce of strength, he grabbed the personal items, the cell phones, the wallets, the coins, and hurled them into the darkness of a side ventilation shaft, which led to unknown depths beneath the station. The objects fell with faint echoes, cutting the cult's connection to the entity. The entity let out a deafening psychic scream that made Daniel fall to his knees, his brain burning. The station lights flickered and went out completely. The white noise from the portable speaker failed, replaced by deafening static. Darkness was absolute. When Daniel's vision adjusted to the dark, he looked at the cult members. They stood motionless on the platform, their heads bowed as if they had been switched off. The dark mist emanating from the center of the platform had vanished. Silence returned to the station, a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the entity, but a relieved quiet, as if the very air had been purified. The battle was won for now. Daniel left the place, crawling back through the maintenance tunnel, his body exhausted, his mind at peace for the first time in months. Months passed since the night at Davenport Square Station. The disappearances on the Red Line drastically decreased. The police never found an explanation, attributing it to a coincidence or people leaving town. The symbols on the subway walls stopped appearing and, eventually, were painted over by the cleaning crew. The public went about their lives above ground, oblivious to the terror that almost manifested beneath their feet. Daniel Hayes returned to his routine as a night security guard. His insomnia had lessened, and he could sleep a few hours each night. But he would never be the same. He still patrolled the tunnels, and occasionally he felt a faint hum in the air, a chill that ran down his spine. He knew the entity hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been silenced, weakened. It was still there, dormant in the forgotten depths beneath Boston, waiting for the city's loneliness and despair to accumulate again, waiting for the cult or a new cult to awaken it. Daniel kept watching. He noticed the empty stares of some passengers, the people who seemed isolated in the crowd. He wondered if they would be the next to hear the call, if the entity was silently beginning to gather its strength again. He never spoke about what he saw or did. No one would believe him. It would just be the crazy story of the insomniac night guard. But he became the silent guardian of the Red Line. Sometimes, late at night, when the platforms were empty and the sound of the last train had died down, Daniel would look into the dark, silent tunnels. He wondered if he could hear a distant whisper or a faint chanting coming from the depths. A reminder that Boston's true terror wasn't above ground in the violence of the streets or the city's problems. It was below, hidden in the silence between the metropolis's heartbeats. And it was just waiting. If you liked this creepy story, hit like and subscribe for more. Stay curious and stay safe out there.